I want you to close your eyes for a moment. Just a moment. Now imagine a child 7, 8 years old, kneeling by the bed in a dark room with hands clasped together. Her mother has just left after saying good night. The candle on the nightstand flickers. And this child, before going to sleep, is quietly repeating a prayer she memorized without fully understanding it. In the middle of the prayer, there is a phrase she repeats every night. The phrase speaks of a place where bad people end up, a place of fire, a place of screams, a place from which no one ever returns. This child goes to sleep, but fear does not sleep. Multiply this scene by thousands, by millions, by billions, for centuries, on all continents, in all languages, parents teaching their children, who would teach their children, who would teach theirs, in an endless chain of frightened whispers that there is an abyss waiting for them, that God is watching, that God is taking notes, and that one day, when the last light of life goes out, the time for reckoning will come. This is the most silent painting in human history, the painting of an entire species that learned very early on to be afraid of itself. And I want you to stop now and answer me, in your thoughts, a very simple question. Who benefited from this? Because fear is not something that appears out of nowhere. Fear does not fall from the sky like rain. Fear is planted. Fear is watered. Fear is harvested. And when you find an idea that, for 2,000 years, kept entire populations docile, obedient, paying religious taxes without complaint, accepting kings without question, silencing in the face of injustice, forgiving the powerful and blaming themselves. When you find an idea with that power, my friend, you are not looking at a historical coincidence. You are looking at the most efficient social engineering tool that the human species has ever built. And almost 400 years ago, one man realized this. One man alone. Poor, thin, with dark eyes, fingers stained by the dust of the glass lenses he polished to survive. A man who lived in rented rooms in Amsterdam, who ate little, who slept less, and who spent his nights writing in a notebook what no one in his time had the courage to write. His name was Baruch Spinoza, and what he discovered on those cold nights of the 17th century was something so dangerous, so explosive, so capable of shaking the foundations of the world he lived in, that because of this discovery, he lost everything a human being can lose. He lost his family. He was declared dead by his own father. He lost the community. The Amsterdam synagogue excommunicated him with the most violent curse that Jewish tradition knows, a curse that has never been revoked, not even today, almost 4 centuries later. He lost almost his life. A fanatic waited for him one night on the synagogue steps and stabbed him. He survived by a hair's breadth, and he kept the torn cloak for the rest of his days, hanging on the wall, as a silent reminder of what happens when you decide to say out loud what the world prefers to keep silent. What had he discovered? What monstrous heresy was this, capable of mobilizing rabbis, pastors, kings, inquisitors, murderers, all against a single man? Brace yourself, because this is where our story begins. He had discovered that hell, as it was taught to humanity, was not a place created by God. It was a place created by men. Very clever men. Men who wore robes and sat on thrones. Men who had understood at some remote moment in antiquity a devastating truth about human nature. A person who fears the afterlife obeys in the now. A person convinced that there is an eternal punishment waiting for them accepts any suffering in the present. A person who believes there is an invisible judge watching every thought of theirs does not need to be watched by visible judges. They police themselves, they punish themselves, they kneel alone. And this, my friend, is gold. This is pure power. This is the master key to all the thrones of Europe, to all the temples of Asia, to all the empires that ever existed. Spinoza looked at that master key for years, and he realized something that no one before him had formulated with such geometric clarity. He realized that that key had not been forged by any deity. It had been forged by human beings in very earthly workshops with very earthly purposes. It had been shaped and perfected over the centuries, generation after generation, by those who profited from its functioning, and it could therefore be understood. It could be dismantled, it could be exposed. And he began to dismantle it, not with anger, not with fury, not with the coarse revolt of someone who wants to topple temples. He dismantled it with the most dangerous thing a man can use against a millennia-old lie: silence, patience, and reason. He took the idea of hell, this colossal monster that had haunted the Western imagination for centuries, and placed it on the table of his mind like a watchmaker would place an unknown clock. He opened the lid, looked inside, examined every gear, every spring, every pin, every wire, and described, piece by piece, with a serene coldness that still frightens today, how that mechanism worked. When he finished, something had changed in the world, forever. Not that fear had ended. Fear is still there in billions of hearts to this day. But from that moment on, there existed in the universe at least one point, one single point, a notebook, some books, a few pages of yellowed paper in Dutch and Latin, where the machine was described, where the gear was exposed, where anyone in any future century who had eyes to read and courage to think could find the entire map of that invisible prison and discover, to their astonishment and liberation, that the cell door was never truly locked. The door had always just been painted with such perfection, with such realism, with such terror, that no one ever thought to push it. That is what we are going to do in the next few hours, you and I. We are going to together push the door. But above all, you are going to find yourself, because this story at its core is not just about him. It is about you. It is about all the times someone planted a fear inside you without asking for permission. It is about all the times you swallowed a doubt for fear of being judged. It is about all the nights you went to sleep, carrying a weight that was never yours to carry. A man only becomes truly free the moment he stops fearing a fire that was never lit. This phrase is the heart of everything that lies ahead. Keep it. Repeat it softly. If necessary, we will discover together who lit this imaginary fire in the minds of humanity, how it was kept alive for 2,000 years, who fed on its flame, and how a single man, with a pen, an inkwell, and supernatural patience, found the narrow and dangerous path to extinguish it. If you have made it this far, it is because there is something in you that still does not accept to sleep. There is a part of you that has long suspected that there are questions you were never allowed to ask. So sit with me. Breathe deeply. Turn off what needs to be turned off. Because what comes next may be, without exaggeration, one of the most important things you will hear for a very, very long time. Amsterdam, the year 1656. Imagine a city that smells of sea air, of salted fish, of damp wood, of fresh ink from newly printed books. A city of dark canals that reflect the windows lit by the orange glow of candles. A city where boats come and go day and night, bringing spices from the Indies, fabrics from China, sugar from Brazil, and, above all, bringing people. People on the run, people being pursued, people with different accents, with tired faces, with stories behind their eyes that are better left unasked. Amsterdam, in the 17th century, was the strangest port in the world. It was Protestant, but tolerated Catholics. It was officially Calvinist, but sheltered Mennonites, Lutherans, Armenians, Quakers, and in a narrow neighborhood cut by stone bridges, it also housed one of the most unique communities in Europe. A community of Sephardic Jews, descendants of those who had been expelled from Spain in 1492, and from Portugal in the following years. People who spoke Portuguese at home, who prayed in Hebrew at the synagogue, and who communicated in the streets in a heavily accented Dutch learned. People who had survived the Inquisition by hiding their faith for generations, pretending to be Christian on the outside, keeping candles lit in cellars in secret, passing prayers from father to son in whispers during the early mornings. This community was, for its members, more than a religion. It was a collective scar. It was the living memory of grandparents burned in public squares, of uncles disappeared in the dungeons of the Holy Office, of great-grandparents who had seen small children torn from their arms in the name of true faith. Arriving in Amsterdam had been, for them, like breathing for the first time after decades submerged. The Dutch, recent Protestants, remembered very well what it was like to be persecuted by Catholics, and for that reason, in a rare calculation of mercy with interest, they left the Jews in peace. As long as these Jews did not cause scandals, as long as they kept their houses in order, as long as they did not attract unnecessary attention from the Protestant authorities. And it was in this neighborhood, on a narrow street called Houtgracht, that a boy was growing up. His name was Baruch. In Hebrew, the word means blessed. He was the son of Miguel, a Portuguese merchant of dried fruits and olive oil, and Hannah, Miguel's second wife, a fragile woman who coughed a lot, who spent her afternoons sewing by the window light, and who would die when the boy was just over 6 years old. Baruch was the second male child of that household, after his older brother Isaac. He had dark, curly hair, very large and attentive eyes, and a silent way of observing adults that, from a very early age, drew attention. That boy observed everything. He watched his father counting coins on the table at night, carefully separating what would go to the synagogue, what would go to pay the suppliers, what would be left for the week's food. He watched the women of the community gathered at the street sink, washing clothes, speaking softly in Portuguese about the families they had left behind in Lisbon, in Coimbra, in Porto. He watched the old men in the synagogue, with their white shawls on their heads, swaying back and forth as they read in Hebrew, with closed eyes and trembling lips. He observed, above all, the silence, the dense silence that fell over certain subjects, the names that could not be pronounced, the questions that no one answered, the cousins who had stayed there and of whom no one ever heard again. One day he would understand. Baruch was enrolled, like every boy in the community, in the Etz Chaim school, which means Tree of Life. It was a good school, a serious school. There, the Jewish boys of Amsterdam learned to read and write in Hebrew. They learned to recite the Torah. They learned the rabbinic commentaries. They learned Talmud. They learned to pronounce each ancient word accurately, each prayer in its correct order, each blessing at its appropriate moment. And it was expected that from the best students, the future rabbis of the community would emerge, the future spiritual leaders, the men who would perpetuate the tradition. Baruch was one of the best students. The teachers noticed very early on that this boy had a different mind. He not only memorized the texts, he understood them. Worse still, or better, depending on the point of view, he questioned them. He raised his hand in the middle of class and asked strange things. He asked why God, being omniscient, would have been surprised by Adam's sin. He asked why Moses, on Mount Sinai, would have asked God to show him his face if he already knew that this was impossible. He asked why some verses of the Holy Book seemed to contradict others. He asked. At first, the teachers answered patiently. After all, curiosity was a virtue up to a point. A good student asks good questions. But as the years went by, as Baruch grew and his questions became sharper, more precise, more uncomfortable, patience began to crack. There was something about that boy that did not quite fit the mold. He was not satisfied with easy answers. He did not accept authority for authority's sake. He wanted to know why, and then why the why, and then why the why of the why, until he reached a point where even the teachers began to sweat. Meanwhile, life at home continued. His father, Miguel, was a respected man in the community, an honest merchant, generous with the tithe, present at all ceremonies. He dreamed of a bright future for his children. He especially dreamed that Baruch, the intelligent boy, the brilliant boy, the boy whom the teachers praised, would one day become a rabbi, a great rabbi, a pride for the family, for the community, for the memory of all the ancestors who had died, so that that surname could survive. That was when the misunderstandings began. Because while the father dreamed, Baruch began to read things that his father did not know, things that circulated in Amsterdam under the radar, recent translations of foreign philosophers, summaries of the new thought coming from France, from a certain René Descartes, fragments of ancient authors, Lucretius, Epicurus, that the Church had condemned centuries ago, but that were now printed in Dutch, in Latin, in cheap editions sold in bookstores in the city centre, texts by Italian humanists, texts by Spanish dissidents, texts that asked the questions Baruch had been silently asking since childhood, but that, for the first time, came accompanied not only by questions, but also by attempts at answers that did not depend on religious authority. It was dizzying. Imagine a 17-year-old boy who had been trained his whole life to accept that true knowledge came exclusively from the scriptures and rabbinic commentaries, opening a new book and discovering that there were people in other corners of the world, in other traditions, conducting radically different inquiries. People who used reason as if reason were by itself a tool capable of reaching the truth. People who looked at nature, at the movement of the stars, at the functioning of the human body, at the mathematical structure of phenomena, and deduced laws, found patterns, established certainties, without needing to ask for permission from any sacred book. A door opened inside him, and he could never close it again. At the same time, at home, tragedy repeated itself. First, his mother, Hannah, died of tuberculosis. Then his older brother, Isaac, right when he was starting to take over the family business. Then his stepmother, Esther. Then his sister, Miriam. Baruch saw one by one the faces of his childhood disappear. He learned too soon that death is not something distant, that it sits at the table, that it enters through the corners, that it carries away without warning the people you love the most. And he also learned something else, perhaps even more disturbing. He learned that when someone dies, the entire community repeats the same prayers, the same rituals, the same comforting formulas. But those formulas, no matter how beautiful they were, did not answer the simplest question a human being can ask in front of a coffin. Where did they go? The rabbis answered. Of course they answered. They answered with quotations, with traditions, with passages from ancient texts. They spoke of the life to come, of the world to come, of Olam Haba. They spoke of judgment, of resurrection, of the soul returning to God. But Baruch, a silent observer since childhood, noticed one thing. He noticed that even while repeating these answers with conviction, the rabbis themselves cried at funerals. He noticed that his father, Miguel, that man of unwavering faith, trembled like a child when Isaac died. He noticed that the certainty preached from the mouth outward was not necessarily the certainty that resided deep in the hearts. No one really knew. Perhaps no one could know. This thought haunted him. And at the same time, it haunted him. It freed him. Because if no one really knew, then perhaps it was allowed, or better yet, it was urgent, to start thinking for himself, to start investigating, to start using reason, as those foreign authors he read in secret did, to try to understand with all the honesty a human being is capable of, what was true behind the ancient words, and what was perhaps invention. It was in this internal silence, in this secret laboratory of the mind of a Jewish boy in the 17th century, that the first seeds of what would come to shake the world began to germinate. They were still fragile seeds. They could still be uprooted. They could still wither in the face of fear, but they were there, and they would grow. Because within that boy, since childhood, there was something that neither the most rigorous teachers, nor the most respected rabbis, nor even his beloved father could erase. Something that would become, in the following years, the indelible mark of everything he would write, of everything he would do, of everything he would suffer. An absolute, silent, then serene refusal to lie to himself. The years passed, and Baruch became an oddly quiet young man. Anyone looking from the outside would see just another Jewish boy from Amsterdam, with his dark tunic, with his books under his arm, crossing the neighborhood bridges towards school or his father's store. Nothing extraordinary, but anyone who could look deeper would see. Inside, and few people can, because it requires an intimacy that almost no one offers to others, would see something completely different. They would see a mind in turmoil, a mind working silently, non-stop, night after night, day after day, comparing texts, dismantling contradictions, reconstructing reality from scratch. Baruch was now 19, 20, 21 years old. His father had also died, and with Miguel's death in 1654, the young man found himself in the curious position of needing to take over the family business. Suddenly, that boy who only wanted to read, think, and discuss ideas had to sit in a hard chair in the warehouse, count sacks of raisins and bottles of olive oil, negotiate with Portuguese suppliers, and collect debts from clients who pretended not to have money. It was a strange period in his life, perhaps the most practical, perhaps the most earthly, a time when he saw up close how the commercial world worked, how people lied, how contracts were deceived, how religion served as a cover for behaviors that had nothing to do with being religious. And he also saw something else. He saw that the community, no matter how united it seemed, was made up of interests. He saw that the wealthier had more weight in the synagogue. He saw that certain families chose marriages not for love, but for commercial alliances. He saw that some rabbis, behind the respect they inspired, were ordinary men, with common vanities, common fears, and common rivalries. None of this scandalized him. He was not naive, but it served to confirm once again an intuition that had been growing in him since childhood. That religion, in the institutional sense, was one thing, and truth, in the profound sense, was another, and that sometimes, not rarely, the two walked in opposite directions. It was during this period that he began to seek, in his free hours, a kind of alternative teacher. His name was Franciscus van den Enden. He was a fascinating character, a former Jesuit, Dutch by birth but educated in Antwerp, in the most refined circles of European Catholic education. He had been expelled from the Society of Jesus under obscure circumstances. There were rumors that it was due to heretical tendencies. Some said it was because of a woman. Others said it was simply for intellectual insubordination. Whatever the reason, Van den Enden had settled in Amsterdam, opened a bookstore in the city centre, and after some difficulties, transformed his home into a kind of informal academy. He taught Latin, he taught Greek, and while he taught these ancient languages, he smuggled in, between a declension and a conjugation, the most explosive thought in Europe. Baruch arrived at this house around the age of 20. Officially, he was going to learn Latin. After all, without Latin, it was impossible to read the great authors. Without Latin, you were stuck with translations. Without Latin, you could not study Descartes in the original, nor Hobbes, nor Giordano Bruno, nor the ancient Cicero, Seneca, Virgil, Ovid. So off went Baruch, as disciplined as ever, to memorize declensions, learn endings, practice irregular conjugations, transcribe passages, translate texts. He was an exceptional student. Of course he was. In a short time he was already reading fluently authors who, for most of his peers, would remain forever inaccessible. But the real learning, as you might imagine, happened after class. After the declensions, after the verbs, Van den Enden would close the textbooks and open others. He opened books that no one could open in public. He spoke of Machiavelli and how the Florentine had described religion not as a path to God, but as a tool of the state. He spoke of Thomas Hobbes and his thesis that political sovereignty needed to be absolute so that society would not dissolve into a war of all against all. He spoke of Galileo and what had happened to him. He spoke of Giordano Bruno, who had been burned alive in Rome a few decades earlier for suggesting that the universe was infinite and that there could be life in other worlds. And he spoke, above all, of René Descartes. Descartes was, at that moment, the great intellectual storm of Europe. He had recently died in 1650 at the court of Queen Christina of Sweden, after being forced to wake up at 5 in the morning to give her lessons in freezing palaces that, it is said, were the cause of his demise. But the books he left behind remained alive, and they remained dangerous. Descartes had proposed something seemingly innocent, but which once accepted changed everything. He proposed that the only sure way to arrive at the truth was to start by doubting everything. Everything indeed. The senses, because the senses deceive. Inherited opinions, because inherited opinions can be false. Traditions, because traditions may have been built on errors. Everything that could not be subjected to the rigorous scrutiny of reason. Accept this, and you will never be the same again. Baruch accepted, not all at once, not overnight, but over months of silent study, of conversations in the back of that bookstore, of sleepless nights spent translating incredibly complicated paragraphs by candlelight. He began to internalize the Cartesian method, and as he internalized it, he carefully applied it to the texts he had learned at Etzheim. He applied it to rabbinic commentaries. He applied it to the very passages of the Torah. He asked in front of each verse, "Can I accept this purely on reason? Does this stand on its own, or does it only stand because tradition told me to accept it?" The experience was both terrifying and dazzling. Terrifying because each certainty that crumbled left a void, and some voids are dizzying. When you discover, for example, that the story your grandmother told about the crossing of the Red Sea may not have happened exactly that way. There is a loss, a small loss, but a loss. When you discover that certain passages of the sacred texts were most likely written by different authors, at different times, with different political intentions, and then stitched together like a patchwork, there is a sadness, a sweet sadness, but real, but dazzling too. Because in place of the inherited certainties, another thing began to emerge, a different kind of certainty, a certainty built brick by brick, argument by argument, by your own mind, in honest conversation with reason, a more naked certainty, simpler, stranger, but infinitely more yours. It was around this time that Baruch began to take notes. In a notebook, a simple notebook, he wrote in Latin because Latin, besides being the universal language of scholars, had the advantage of being little read by the neighbors. The neighbors, if they entered his room, would see a bunch of incomprehensible words and think it was schoolwork. But it wasn't. What was in that notebook was something much more dangerous. They were the first formulations of what, years later, would come to be called his philosophy. They were the first sketches of a revolutionary idea about God, about nature, about the human soul, about freedom, about the state, about religion. He was not in a hurry. He wrote slowly. He erased. He rewrote. He went back to erasing. There were days when he spent hours on a single sentence trying to find the exact formulation. There were weeks when he wrote nothing, just read, just thought, just let the ideas ferment. He had learned from Descartes a precious thing, that haste is the enemy of truth, that a single well-constructed sentence is worth more than 1,000 poorly thought-out pages, that the true philosopher is not the one who writes a lot, but the one who writes exactly. In this process, little by little, he began to feel something uncomfortable. He began to feel that he could no longer participate in the rituals of the synagogue with his whole heart. He could attend, he could recite the words, he could make the proper bows at the right moments, but something inside him, as he kept thinking, was distancing itself. He looked at the white-bearded men around him, repeating the blessings with such conviction, and felt a kind of tenderness mixed with melancholy. Tenderness because he loved them. They were his people, they were his former teachers, they were family friends. Melancholy because he could no longer believe with the purity he once had that each of those formulas corresponded exactly to what they claimed to correspond. He still did not have the words to express this, but he already knew deep down that one day he would need to speak, and he also knew with a kind of melancholic premonition that when he finally spoke, the price would be high. The year everything collapsed was 1656. Baruch was 23, almost 24. He still lived in a modest house in the Jewish neighborhood, still struggled to maintain the business inherited from his father, still attended the synagogue on important dates. On the outside, nothing had changed. On the inside, everything had changed, but internal changes, as you know, do not always remain internal forever. There comes a moment when they overflow, and that year they overflowed. It began, as these things usually do, with whispers. Someone had heard young Baruch saying strange things in an informal conversation. Someone I had noticed that he was missing certain rituals more frequently than was acceptable. Someone had noticed that he spent a lot of time at the house of a former Jesuit who taught Latin and, they say, other things. Two men, reportedly named Johannes Cassiarius, and a companion whose name has been lost to time, sought out Baruch under the pretext of discussing religion. They wanted to understand, they said, the doubts he had been having. They wanted to discuss, like good friends, the issues that tormented him. Baruch, perhaps out of overconfidence, perhaps out of a genuine desire to engage in dialogue, perhaps because he was too tired of pretending, spoke. He spoke of things that, when voiced in a Jewish community of the 17th century, were pure dynamite. He spoke that he was not sure that the human soul was immortal in the traditional sense. He spoke that he did not see, in a careful reading of ancient texts, clear evidence that Moses had personally written the first 5 books of the Bible. He spoke that the idea of God, as it was preached, seemed more like a human projection than an accurate description of reality. He spoke that perhaps, just perhaps, God and nature were at their core one and the same, and that, being so, miracles in the sense of violating natural laws would be impossible, because it would not make sense for God to violate his own nature. The two men listened in silence. Days later, whispers were everywhere. The council of elders of the synagogue, the Mahamad, as it was called, summoned Baruch. They wanted to talk. They wanted to understand in the young man's own words what he was thinking. They wanted perhaps to offer a way back. Baruch attended. The elders were seated around a long table in a dimly lit room. Old men with white beards, tired eyes, hands marked by decades of work and reading. Men who had escaped the Inquisition, who had built that community from nothing, who now saw before them a brilliant young man, son of a respectable merchant, a standout student of Etzheim, a potential future rabbi being accused of thoughts that, if true, could destroy everything they had achieved. They tried, the reports say, to be kind. They offered Baruch a deal, a very specific deal. He would publicly recant in a ceremony at the synagogue what he had said in private conversations. He would reaffirm orthodoxy. He would reaffirm the authority of tradition. He would reaffirm the immortality of the soul, the divine origin of the texts, the reality of miracles. In exchange, he would receive an annual pension, 1,000 florins, according to some sources, a considerable sum, enough to live comfortably for the rest of his life without having to polish lenses, without having to chase clients, without having to go hungry. All he had to do was say, out loud, what he no longer believed. Baruch refused. It is not known exactly with what words. Some say he simply remained silent. Some say he responded with a slight nod of his head. Some say he argued at length, respectfully, but without yielding an inch. What is known is that he left that room without signing anything, without promising anything, without bowing his neck. The elders then understood that they were faced with a problem that had no easy solution. In the days that followed, they deliberated, they consulted, they prayed, they searched the ancient books for precedents, and they reached, with regret but with firmness, a conclusion. That young man, son of Miguel, grandson of Isaac, great-grandson of so many Spinozas who had suffered for their faith, needed to be expelled. But not just any expulsion, an expulsion so harsh, so definitive, so filled with terror that it would serve as an example for any other young person who in the future felt similar temptations. A curse in the heaviest form that tradition allowed. The cherem. On July 27, 1656, Baruch Spinoza, aged 23, was formally expelled from the Jewish community of Amsterdam. The ceremony, according to records, was terrible. In the synagogue, before the gathered faithful, the Hazan, the official cantor, read aloud in Hebrew, with a trembling voice, the text of the cherem. The black candles were lit. The shofar, that ram's horn used in solemn moments, was blown with a long, hoarse, funereal sound. And the words of the curse fell upon Baruch's name, with a weight that many of the listeners would describe for the rest of their lives as the heaviest sound they had ever heard in that synagogue. Cursed be he by day, and cursed be he by night. Cursed when he lies down, and cursed when he rises, cursed when he goes out, and cursed when he comes in. May the Lord never forgive him. May the Lord's wrath and zeal be kindled against this man. May all the curses written in the book of the law fall upon him. May the Lord erase his name from under heaven, and to further worsen the isolation, the practical instructions. No one may speak to him, neither in writing nor in word. No one may render him any service. No one may stay under the same roof as him. No one may come within 4 cubits of his person. No one may read anything he has written or will write. In a single day, Baruch was erased. Erased from the neighborhood where he had grown up. Erased from the streets where he had played as a boy. Erased from the circle of friends. Erased from official memories. Officially, he ceased to exist. If a relative encountered him on the street, they had to cross to the other side. If an old schoolmate saw him from afar, they had to look away. If a cousin needed to speak with him, even for the most urgent reason, they could not. And he was 23 years old. Think about that for a moment. A 23-year-old boy, orphaned of father and mother, with no living siblings, no wife, no children, discovering that the entire community in which he had grown up, where his family was buried, where all the faces he had known since birth had just closed the door permanently, forever. How does one react to something like that? Most of us would crumble. Most would beg for forgiveness, turn back, sign any necessary paper to regain their family. After all, what are a few words of retraction against the monstrous weight of being alone in the world? It's just pretending, it's just saying what they want to hear, it's just bowing for a few minutes, and everything goes back to normal. Millions of human beings throughout history have done exactly that, and no one has the right to judge them. Cowardice in the face of absolute solitude is one of the most human things there is. But Baruch did not bow. It is said, and this is one of those phrases that linger, that when they read him the cherem, he simply said, with a calm that astonished the witnesses, "This does not obligate me to do anything I was not already willing to do alone." In translation, if you want me to leave, I was already on my way out. If you want me to be silent, know that I have never been silent on what matters. If you think this curse will destroy me, you do not understand who I am. He gathered his things, which were not many. A few books, the notebook, some clothes, little money, and left the neighborhood. Ahead of him lay a whole life to be built from scratch, and in a corner of his soul, perhaps in that corner that the elders had never managed to reach even with the harshest words, there was something that no one could take away, a small flame, a silent flame, the flame of one who discovered that the whole world can collapse, that family can disappear, that the community can curse you, but that the truth, when it truly lodges within you, can no longer be extirpated. He walked down that street of the Jewish neighborhood that July afternoon and did not look back. To understand what happened next, you need to understand one simple thing about Amsterdam at that time. Amsterdam was big. Amsterdam was cosmopolitan. Amsterdam was in many ways the most tolerant city in Europe. And precisely because of that, outside the Jewish neighborhood, there was a whole different world waiting for Baruch, a world where no one cared about the Muhammad's curse, a world where no one knew what a cherem was, a world where he could, if he wanted, start over under any name, invent a new biography, live as if he had never been born a Jew. But Baruch did not want to invent anything. He did not adopt a Christian name. He did not try to integrate with the Protestants. He did not try to pass as Dutch. He simply took his own Hebrew name, Baruch, and translated it into Latin, Benedictus, which means exactly the same thing, blessed. From then on, when presenting himself in the Gentile world, he would be Benedictus de Spinoza, or simply Bento to friends. The name changed language, but the meaning remained intact. He continued to be, at heart, the same blessed one as always, only now blessed without. Official blessing of no one but his own. The first months were tough. The family business was officially transferred to creditors and other community members. He could no longer make a living as a merchant, especially since trading with Jews was impossible after the cherem, and the ports were full of Jews. He needed a new profession, a profession that could be practiced in silence, without relying on complex social relationships, without needing ecclesiastical licenses, without having to submit to any closed guild. He needed something he could do alone, in a room, earning enough for bread and candles. That's when lens grinding came into play. 17th century Holland was undergoing a scientific explosion. Microscopes were being invented. Telescopes were being perfected. Glasses were becoming popular among scholars. There was a growing demand for quality lenses. And lenses, at that time, were made by hand, in a meticulous, almost artisanal process that involved polishing raw glass against metal discs with abrasive pastes for hours on end, until the surface reached the mathematically precise curvature necessary to refract light correctly. It was an ideal job for him, solitary, silent. It required mathematical precision, something that suited his mind. It could be done at home. It paid modestly but enough, and it had a symbolic aspect that in retrospect is almost moving. He began to earn a living polishing instruments for better vision, literally crafting tools that allowed others to look deeper into reality. While in the spare hours, he did exactly the same thing with his mind. He polished thoughts, refined every word, honed every sentence, until they reflected, with the greatest possible precision, the deeper structure of things. In no time he became known in scientific circles, even though no one saw him in person, even though he lived reclusively in small rooms, first in Amsterdam, then in Rijnsburg, then in Voorburg, then in The Hague. The lenses he produced reached famous hands. They reached Christian Huygens, the great astronomer. They reached researchers in England. They reached, through correspondence, Leibniz. His name circulated quietly with respect among those who understood, but above all in those years of isolation, he wrote, and what he wrote silently in those rented rooms was becoming an increasingly impressive construction. Because Baruch Spinoza was not an ordinary philosopher, he had decided, shortly after his expulsion, to do something that no one before him had attempted with such systematic rigor. He decided to address the questions of the human soul, of God, of religion, of morality, of freedom, of happiness, with the same rigor that geometers applied to triangles. He wanted to build an entire philosophy, as Euclid had built geometry, starting with clear definitions, moving on to evident axioms, deducing step by step each theorem from what had been previously demonstrated, leaving no room for vague interpretation, for sentimentality, for blind obedience to ancient authorities. It was a bold bet, an almost absurd bet, because matters of the soul have historically always been treated as the opposite of geometry. They are fluid, emotional, mysterious. Poets speak of them, mystics speak of them, prophets speak of them. But who has ever tried to demonstrate them with the rigor of a mathematical proof? Spinoza was going to try, and as he tried, he was slowly constructing the idea that would change everything. The idea that God was not an old bearded man sitting on a throne beyond the clouds. The idea that God was not an angry judge ready to punish the disobedient. The idea that God was not a person in the sense that we are people, with moods, preferences, jealousies, vendettas. The idea that God was in fact something else, something both much simpler and much more dizzying. God was the infinite substance, the absolute reality. Everything that exists, everything that can exist, everything that has ever existed or will exist, expressing itself in infinite attributes, of which we humans know only two, thought and extension. God was, in the words that would later become famous, Deus sive natura, God or nature. Two words for the same reality, two ways of naming the same infinite, eternal, necessary thing that could not exist because its essence implied its existence. This idea, when you hear it for the first time today, may seem abstract. It may even seem harmless, but at that time, stated that way, it was a bomb, because it knocked down in a single blow the entire structure of the personal God that the three great monotheistic religions had preached for millennia. If God is nature, then God does not choose. If God is nature, then God does not repent, does not get angry, does not love some and hate others. If God is nature, then God does not send particular prophets, does not make covenants with specific peoples, does not decide who goes to heaven and who goes to hell. And here we reach the most explosive point of all. If God is nature, then all the apparatus of heaven and hell, all that system of rewards and punishments after death collapses, not because God is cruel or absent or indifferent, but because God, understood correctly, simply is not the kind of entity that operates that way. Nature neither rewards nor punishes. Nature simply is. Stones fall, planets spin, bodies are born, grow, get sick, die. Everything happens according to necessary laws which can be known by human reason. And amidst these laws there is no place for a cosmic court, with furious judges, distributing eternal condemnations to frightened sinners. Spinoza reached this conclusion alone, in silence with the patience of a geometer, and he began to write. Slowly, in the intervals between hours of grinding, on nights when the room was silent and only the crackling of the candle could be heard, he was constructing the work that would later simply be called Ethics. It was not an ordinary book. It had no narratives. It had no characters. It had no stories. It had definitions, axioms, propositions, corollaries, scholia. It was a logical cathedral, cold on the outside, but inside pulsating with a passion for truth that still haunts any attentive reader today. He knew that once published, that book would provoke a storm. He knew that the rabbis would hate him even more, if that were possible. He knew that Calvinist pastors would pursue him. He knew that Catholic priests would excommunicate him if they could. He knew that kings and princes, upon realizing the political implications of what he was writing, would likely try to prohibit the circulation of copies. He knew that some readers, upon reading certain passages, would throw the book away in disgust. He knew that others, upon reading those same passages, would cry with recognition, because for the first time in their lives, they would be reading, in clear words, what they had always silently suspected, but had never been able to articulate. That's why he worked with such care. So much care, in fact, that he decided in his lifetime to publish almost none of what he wrote. He would leave the manuscripts for his closest friends. He would instruct them, when the time came, to publish after his death without the author's name, to protect themselves from the consequences. It was, in a way, our survival strategy, but it was also at its core an act of extreme trust in the future. He believed that ideas, once recorded with sufficient clarity, would find their way on their own. They did not need promotion. They did not need loud publicity. They only needed to exist patiently, waiting for readers who in any century had eyes to read them. It was with this silent confidence that he continued polishing lenses during the day and polishing phrases at night, year after year, while around him Europe continued its brutal dance of religious wars, persecutions, bonfires, apocalyptic prophecies. He was quietly building what may be the greatest workshop of mental freedom ever erected by a single man. There is an image that, for me, summarizes better than any other those years of Baruch Spinoza polishing lenses and polishing ideas. Imagine a small room in an attic in Rijnsburg, a quiet village on the outskirts of Amsterdam, where he moved in 1661, 5 years after his excommunication. The village was simple, red brick houses, streets paved with uneven stones, a windmill slowly turning on the horizon, a narrow canal with some fishing boats docked. It was a good place to disappear, exactly the kind of place where no one asks many questions and where a reclusive young scholar can live undisturbed. In the room, the furniture was minimal: a narrow bed, a dark wooden table, a hard chair, a low shelf with a few carefully chosen books: Euclid, Descartes, Hobbes, some volumes in Hebrew that he had managed to keep despite the ban. On an auxiliary table, his miniature workshop, a small lathe, polishing discs, jars of abrasive pastes, cloths, lenses in various stages of finishing, each wrapped in a piece of fabric to avoid scratching. And on the main table, next to the inkwell and the quill, the thread leads to another. And this interconnectedness, this web of dependencies, is what Spinoza sought to reveal. He proposed that everything that exists is part of a single substance, which he called God or nature. This idea was radical, because it challenged the traditional view of a personal anthropomorphic God who created the world and intervened in it. Instead, Spinoza's God was immanent, present in everything, and the universe itself was a manifestation of divine substance. Spinoza's philosophy was not just an abstract exercise. It had profound implications for how we understand ourselves and our place in the world. If everything is interconnected, then our actions and thoughts are not isolated events, but part of a larger whole. This realization can lead to a sense of responsibility towards others and the environment. It encourages empathy, as we recognize that the suffering of one is the suffering of all. Moreover, Spinoza's view of God and nature as one challenges the dualism that has dominated Western thought. Instead of seeing a divide between the sacred and the secular, Spinoza invites us to see the divine in the natural world. This perspective can lead to a more profound appreciation of life and existence as we begin to see the beauty and complexity of the universe as expressions of the divine. As Spinoza developed his ideas, he also grappled with the nature of human emotions and how they relate to our understanding of the world. He believed that many of our emotions are the result of inadequate ideas or misunderstandings about the nature of reality. By gaining a clearer understanding of ourselves and the world around us, we can transform our emotions and achieve a state of greater peace and joy. This process of understanding is not merely intellectual, it is deeply ethical. Spinoza argued that knowledge leads to virtue. The more we understand the interconnectedness of all things, the more we are compelled to act in ways that promote harmony and well-being. This ethical dimension of his philosophy is what makes it so relevant today as we face global challenges that require collective action and a shift in our values. In summary, Spinoza's philosophy is a call to recognize the unity of existence and our place within it. It challenges us to rethink our relationship with the world, to embrace our interconnectedness, and to cultivate a deeper understanding of ourselves and others. This journey towards understanding is not just a personal endeavor, it is a collective one, as we seek to create a more just and compassionate world. As we reflect on Spinoza's life and work, we see a man who, despite facing rejection and isolation, chose to engage with the world through his writing. His letters, his philosophical treatises, and his unwavering commitment to truth serve as a testament to the power of ideas to transcend time and space. They remind us that, even in solitude, we are never truly alone. We are part of a larger conversation that spans generations and connects us to those who seek understanding and meaning in their lives. In this way, Spinoza's legacy continues to inspire and challenge us. His vision of a world where knowledge leads to freedom and compassion is a guiding light for those who dare to question, to seek, and to understand. As we navigate the complexities of our own lives, we can draw strength from his example, knowing that the pursuit of truth is a noble and transformative journey. Another, and another. Therefore, what truly exists in a genuinely independent manner is a single thing, a thing that contains within itself this infinite web of dependencies, a thing that does not depend on anything outside of it, because there is nothing outside of it, a thing that, to exist, does not need any external cause, because it is itself the totality. This thing Spinoza calls substance, and substance in his philosophy can only be one. There can only be one. Because if there were two truly independent substances, they would limit each other, and then neither would be truly infinite, truly complete, truly substance. There is only room for one thing that is everything, and this thing, this unique substance, this infinite totality, he calls God, or equally nature, God or nature, Deus sive natura. This is the formulation that shook Europe, because notice, it changes everything. God, here, is not a person. God is not a cosmic king sitting on some throne. God does not have wills like ours, preferences like ours, whims like ours. God is the entire reality. God is the infinite totality of the things that exist and the laws according to which they exist. God is, at the same time, the physical universe, all matter, all energy, all bodies, and the rational order that runs through it, all the laws, all the patterns, all the mathematical structure that makes the universe intelligible. When you look at a sunset, you are looking at God. When you think a clear thought, you are participating in God. When you feel the blood running through your veins, you are a small, finite, transient expression of an infinite, eternal reality that continues to exist after you, as a particular mode, cease to exist. Do you understand why this idea was explosive? It does not deny God. On the contrary, it places God everywhere. It makes God the most immediate, closest, most concrete thing possible. The God of Spinoza is not hidden in some distant heaven to which you need to ascend spiritually. He is at your fingertips as you read this. He is in the air that enters your lungs. He is in the ground that supports your feet. He is literally everything that exists. But, and here comes the dangerous point, this God does not have the characteristics that traditional religions attribute to their God. This God does not choose a people and reject others. This God does not decree specific commandments on a certain mountain. This God does not incarnate in a particular man at a certain time in history. This God does not care about the rituals we invent to honor him. This God is not offended when we doubt him. This God does not reward the faithful with heaven, nor punish the unfaithful with eternal fire. Because this God, being the totality of nature, operates by necessity, not by choice. Things happen in the world according to eternal laws, and these laws are themselves the expression of God. A stone falls because of the law of gravity, which is an expression of God. A thought unfolds in your head according to mental laws, which are an expression of God. A society develops according to historical dynamics, which are they too expressions of God. There is no room anywhere for miraculous interventions. There is no room for God to change his mind. There is no room for God to respond to a specific request. Do you understand what this does to the entire structure of revealed religions? It dismantles it. It dismantles it without needing to deny the existence of God. On the contrary, affirming it more strongly than ever, but completely transforming the meaning of the word God. It was this philosophical operation, silent and relentless, that Spinoza carried out in his rented room, line by line, proposition by proposition. And he did not stop there, because from this central idea, all the other great questions of human life need to be rethought. What is the human soul in this philosophy? It is not a substance separate from the body. It is not a little ghost that temporarily inhabits the body, and that at death flies away to somewhere. The soul is, in Spinoza's view, the idea of the body. It is the same fact, a human being, seen from two different angles. From the material angle, you are a body. From the mental angle, you are a soul. But they are not two things that stick together. It is a single thing, with two inseparable aspects. Consequence? When the body dies, the soul as an individual phenomenon also ends, because it was the idea of that particular body. When the body ceases, the idea ceases. What survives is not a personal soul with its memories and individual traits. What survives is that in you which belongs to the eternal, the part of your mind that understood, during life, eternal truths, which is, ultimately, the very mind of God expressing itself in you. See how this is different from traditional heaven. Spinoza is not promising a reunion with loved ones in a landscape of clouds. He is not promising recognition, reward, continuity of personality. He is saying something much more austere and at the same time much deeper. He is saying that the part of us that thought truths during life participates, because of that very fact, in something that does not die. Not because it continues to exist as a personal phenomenon after death, but because it was, from the very beginning, an expression of the eternal, and the eternal has no beginning or end. And hell, then? Well, hell, in this framework, simply does not exist. It does not exist as a place. It does not exist as post-death torment. It does not exist as a destination that God reserves for the disobedient. Because God, understood correctly, does not reserve punitive destinies. God is the very natural order, and the natural order does not have a secret sector of eternal tortures. What exists, Spinoza recognizes this with complete clarity, is suffering. A lot of suffering. In this world, in this life, now. There are people living lives that are, in many aspects, hellish. There are people dominated by disordered passions, by hatreds, by jealousies, by devouring ambitions. There are people who consume themselves in envy, who live enslaved by pleasures that do not satisfy, who die bitter and empty. This, for Spinoza, is the only real hell. And paradise, likewise, is something that begins here. Paradise is the state of a mind that has understood, at least in part, the eternal order of things, and that has therefore found a peace that no external storm can shake. Heaven and hell are, in Spinoza's philosophy, mental states of this life, not geographical places of another. Stop and think for a moment about what this means, if it is true. It means that an entire psychological infrastructure, built over centuries to control entire populations, crumbles. It means that the threat that weighed over billions of human heads for millennia was empty. It means that infinite guilt, night terrors, existential anxiety regarding the final judgment, all of this was the consequence of a human construction. A brilliantly effective construction, but a construction. Nothing more. Now you understand why Spinoza was so disturbing. He was not simply proposing an alternative theory. He was dismantling, piece by piece, the mental edifice that supported half of the political power of 17th century Europe. And he was doing this with a frightening calm, without insults, without provocations, without a revolutionary tone, just with demonstrations, just with geometry, just with patient reason, the worst kind of enemy that an orthodoxy can face. Because you can silence a shout, You can exile a revolutionary. You can burn an incendiary pamphlet. But what to do with a man who, in the silence of his room, is writing propositions in Latin with the same serenity of a mathematician, deducing theorems about triangles? You can only try to prevent him from being read. And that is exactly what years later the authorities would try to do. The book was published in 1670. But before talking about it, let me tell you how the process of its publication went, because it is a story in itself. A story that perfectly illustrates the kind of care, fear, courage mixed with prudence that surrounded any dangerous idea in that time of Europe. Spinoza had finished the manuscript after 5 years of intense work. 5 years of parallel polishing, lenses during the day, paragraphs at night. 5 years of conversations with trusted friends who read excerpts, suggested corrections, asked questions that forced him to refine arguments. When he finally put a period at the end of the last page, he had in his hands a book of more than 300 pages in impeccable Latin, dealing with the most explosive themes imaginable. The nature of the scriptures, the history of the Hebrew people, the problem of miracles, the difference between faith and reason, the role of religion in the state, and the systematic defense of freedom of thought. He knew perfectly what that book would cause. That is why he took precautions. First, he decided not to put his own name on the cover. The book would be published anonymously. The author would be described only as a friend of freedom. Second, he decided not to indicate the true publisher or the actual city of publication. The cover would bear a fictitious publisher's name, Henricus Kunrat, and a fictitious city, Hamburg. Third, the book would be published only in Latin, at least initially, to restrict its circulation to educated readers, far from the reach of the common people. Translations into vernacular languages, Spinoza and his friends knew, would only attract more attention and more danger. In reality, the book was printed in Amsterdam, at the printing house of Jan Reeuwits, a discreet publisher known for publishing heterodox works. It is called Theological Political Treatise, a sober title, an almost academic title, a title that does not prepare anyone for the earthquake that awaits in the following pages. Because what this book does is, in essence, demonstrate 3 things that, together, destroy the philosophical foundation of organized religions as they operated at that time. First demonstration: sacred books are not works directly dictated by God. They are human works, written by human authors, in specific historical contexts, with historically situated intentions. Spinoza shows this with an approach that would later be called historical criticism of the scriptures. He is one of the pioneers. Before him, it was almost unimaginable to read the Bible as one reads any other ancient book, examining style, comparing passages, identifying inconsistencies, inferring dates of composition, asking why such an author wrote such a thing in such a circumstance. After him, this approach became the standard of modern biblical studies. He examined the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, and demonstrated with detailed textual arguments that it could not have been written by Moses, as tradition claimed. There were passages that describe Moses' own death. There were references to events that only occurred long after the time when Moses supposedly lived. There were repetitions, contradictions, changes in style that suggested multiple authors stitched together over centuries by anonymous editors. Spinoza was not attacking the Bible. He was reading it. He was reading it with honesty. And honesty, applied to that text, produced devastating conclusions for orthodoxy. Second demonstration: miracles in the traditional sense of violations of the laws of nature are not possible. Why? Because the laws of nature, in Spinoza's philosophy, are the expression of God himself. To say that God violates the laws of nature would be to say that God contradicts himself, that he acts against himself. What we call a miracle, therefore, is either a misinterpretation of a natural phenomenon that we have not yet understood, or it is a literary fiction created by ancient authors to impress their readers and reinforce certain messages. In both cases, miracles are ultimately expressions of human ignorance or poetic license, not of direct divine intervention. Third demonstration: religion, when mixed with political power, becomes a terrible weapon in the hands of the few against the many. And for that reason, the only healthy way to organize a society is to separate religion from the state, guarantee the broadest freedom of thought and expression, and allow each citizen to philosophize as they wish, as long as they respect the public laws necessary for coexistence. This third demonstration is, in many ways, the most revolutionary, because it is there that Spinoza steps out of the purely philosophical sphere and enters the concrete political sphere. It is there that he proposes, with impressive foresight, the basic principles of what would later be called a secular state. Freedom of conscience, freedom of expression, the right of each person to think and say what they want, even when those ideas challenge established religious authorities. Can you imagine what this represented in 1670? Imagine Europe that year, a Europe where people were still being burned for heresy, where the Portuguese and Spanish Inquisitions were still active, where Protestants and Catholics were still clashing in bloody wars, where Holland, despite being the most tolerant of nations, still had furious Calvinist pastors preaching from the pulpits against any sign of religious liberalism, where saying aloud that the Bible was not written by Moses, that miracles did not occur, that religion should be separated from the state, was literally flirting with violent death. The book fell like a meteor. At first, the reaction was relatively contained. The book circulated among the literate, among scholars, among dissidents of all kinds. Many marveled, some were scandalized, but since it was in Latin, the reach was limited. However, very quickly, the author's identity began to leak. It was not a secret for long. Those who knew Spinoza recognized the style, the geometric method, the references. Within a few months, all relevant intellectual circles knew that this book was the work of the excommunicated philosopher from Amsterdam. And then the storm came. First, the Amsterdam rabbis. They could no longer excommunicate him as they had excommunicated him 14 years earlier, but they reaffirmed the curse, published warnings against the book, instructed that no one from the Jewish community read it, under penalty of punishment. Second, the Calvinist pastors. They began to preach violent sermons against the book. They wrote refutations in quickly printed pamphlets. They asked the civil authorities to prohibit its circulation. Third, the Catholic Church. Although Spinoza did not live in Catholic territory, Pope Innocent XVIII placed the book on the Index Librorum Prohibitorum in 1679, the official index of books prohibited to Catholic faithful, to belong to the same list as Galileo, Luther, Machiavelli, a kind of dark honor. Fourth, the Dutch government itself. In 1674, 4 years after publication, the states of Holland formally prohibited the circulation of the treatise, not because of a persecution of Spinoza personally, but because the book was causing too much agitation, and the moderates in the government wanted to appease the radical Calvinists. Spinoza, reclusive in The Hague since 1670, watched all this with a calmness that still perplexes me today. The letters from that period are impressive. He was not shaken. He did not panic. He did not try to flee the country. He continued his routine, polishing lenses in the morning and afternoon, writing at night, occasionally receiving friends, exchanging correspondence with scholars from various nations. He continued, in other words, being Spinoza. But he made an important decision. He would never publish again during his lifetime. The Ethics, which was already almost finished at that time, he would keep in the drawer. He would let his friends publish it after his death. Other smaller writings too. The risk of direct publication was too great, and he had more important things to do than defend himself in legal proceedings or escape from violent fanatics. However, he had an episode that perfectly illustrates the kind of courage Spinoza had. A small episode in history, but revealing. In 1672, Holland was simultaneously invaded by France, England, and 2 German principalities. It was a terrible year for the country. The moderate Republican government, led by the De Witt brothers, fell into popular disgrace for not having adequately prepared the defenses. An enraged crowd, incited by Orangists and Calvinists, attacked Johann and Cornelis de Witt in the street in The Hague and brutally lynched them. The bodies were hung, mutilated, partially devoured by fanatics. Spinoza knew the De Witts. He admired them, especially Johann, who had been an enlightened statesman, a defender of religious tolerance, a silent protector of heterodox thinkers. When he learned of the lynching, Spinoza, normally calm, was beside himself. He prepared a poster with the words, "Ultimi Barbarorum," the most barbarous of the barbarians, and would have gone out to hang it at the site of the massacre as a public protest. His landlord, terrified at the possibility that the crowd would lynch him too, locked him in his house and prevented him from going out. This episode, more than many pages of philosophy, shows who Baruch Spinoza was: a man capable of indignation, a man willing to physically risk himself for a cause he considered just, a man who, behind the serene mask of the geometric philosopher, had a heart capable of fury in the face of barbarism. He returned, in the following days, to his routine, to lens polishing, to writing the ethics, to the patience with which he treated, in letters, his correspondence. But those who had seen him that day with the poster would never forget. The last 5 years of Spinoza's life, between 1672 and 1677, were both his most productive and his most silent. Productive because he completed the ethics, wrote most of the political treatise, a work that would remain unfinished, maintained an intense correspondence with scientists and philosophers from various nations, and continued polishing lenses with increasing mastery, receiving orders from some of the greatest scientific names in Europe. Silent because he stubbornly refused to publish anything new under his own name. He firmly refused a chair that was offered to him, with great honor, at the University of Heidelberg. He refused pensions. He refused patrons. He refused anything that could compromise what he considered the most precious asset a philosopher can have: the absolute freedom to think and write without accounting to anyone. The offer from the University of Heidelberg deserves a few paragraphs because it well illustrates the character of the man. In 1673, the Elector Palatine, Charles Louis, sent his advisor Fabritius to write a formal letter to Spinoza. The Elector, an important figure in the Germanic world, wanted to offer the philosopher a chair in philosophy at the most prestigious university in his lands, a generous salary, elevated academic status, housing, international recognition, everything any intellectual of the time could dream of, a chance to escape obscurity, abandon the manual labor of polishing lenses, and live off the fruits of thought. There was only one condition: that he would not abuse this freedom to disturb the established religion. Spinoza thought for a few days and wrote a response that, just by itself, would place him among the greats. He deeply thanked the honor. He acknowledged that the offer was generous and that under normal circumstances it would be a wonderful opportunity. But he explained with his usual calmness that he could not accept, for 2 reasons. First, because by accepting a public chair, he would have to dedicate his time to teaching, which would distance him from the private philosophical research he considered his true vocation. Second, and more importantly, because the imposed condition, that he not disturb the established religion, was exactly the kind of limitation he could not accept. How could one know in advance what would or would not disturb the established religion? The only way to avoid that risk would be not to philosophize seriously, and that, for him, was the same as ceasing to exist. So, politely, respectfully, he declined. And he continued in his rented home in The Hague, polishing lenses, living modestly, thinking freely. This episode moves me. Think of how many people, throughout history, have traded their intellectual freedom for the security of a position, for the comfort of a fixed salary, for the prestige of a title. Think of how many have gradually given up the audacity of thought to fit into institutions that offered protection in exchange for domestication. Not Spinoza. Spinoza preferred to continue breathing glass dust rather than accept a golden chain. He knew something that many of us struggle to learn. He knew that freedom once lost is hard to recover, that every small compromise we make with our own voice, in exchange for material advantages, leaves a scar. That courage, like a muscle, atrophies when not exercised, that it is easier to remain whole from the beginning than to rebuild oneself after being shattered into pieces. Spinoza's health during those last years visibly deteriorated. Tuberculosis, likely combined with the effects of inhaling glass dust over decades, was consuming his lungs. He coughed frequently, he lost weight, he tired quickly. But he continued working, he continued writing, he continued receiving visitors with the silent courtesy he always had. One of those visits in November 1676 was from Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. Leibniz, the great German philosopher and mathematician, one of the founders of infinitesimal calculus, which he would create in parallel with Newton, generating a historical dispute, made a point of spending a few days in The Hague to meet Spinoza in person. The two talked at length, in several sessions, about philosophy, mathematics, politics. Leibniz read excerpts from the still unpublished Ethics. He asked detailed questions. He raised objections. Later, publicly, Leibniz distanced himself from Spinoza, denying having been influenced by him. He was afraid of what the association with such a damned name could do to his career. But in his private notebooks, discovered only centuries later, there are notes that show how much Spinoza had marked him, how much of that geometric and relentless philosophy had forever entered his own way of thinking. It is a sad and beautiful example at the same time, sad because it shows Leibniz's cowardice, beautiful because it shows the inevitable strength of Spinoza's ideas, even when denied in public. In early 1677 it became clear that the end was near. Baruch Spinoza was now 44 years old. His body was in tatters. He coughed up blood. He could barely cross the room without becoming breathless. He knew he had little time left, but until the last moment, he maintained an admirable composure. On February 21, 1677, Sunday, he asked his landlord, a painter named Hendrik van der Spik, to call a doctor. The doctor came, a friend named Lodewijk Meyer, who came from Amsterdam especially to care for him in those last days. Spinoza asked the landlord and his family to go to church, so they wouldn't worry. He would be alone with Meyer. When the landlord returned a few hours later, Baruch Spinoza had died. There are no detailed accounts of his last moments. Meyer later would only say that Baruch had died peacefully, without agony, conversing calmly until almost the end. No last-minute conversion. No regret. None of the dramatic scenes that organized religions like to place at the deathbeds of their enemies to show that in the end everyone surrenders. Spinoza died as he had lived, coherent, silent, free. His funeral a few days later was modest. His body was buried in a Christian cemetery, in a new church in The Hague, because the Jews would not accept him, and because he had technically lived for the last 20 years outside any organized religion. The original tomb was lost over time. The remains were probably scattered, a common fate for those who had no family to care for the grave. But the writings remained. Friends, following his instructions, collected the manuscripts and published them still in 1677, a few months after his death. The volume, called Opera Postuma, contained the Ethics, the unfinished political treatise, the treatise on the improvement of the understanding, the philosophical correspondence, and a Hebrew grammar he was also writing, more as a linguistic hobby than as a main work. The volume was predictably banned. In the Netherlands in 1678, the authorities officially banned it. In the following years, other governments did the same. Spinoza's name became, for almost a century, synonymous with atheism, materialism, immorality. Being accused of Spinozism was a serious accusation that could destroy careers, imprison people, tarnish families. The thinkers of the 18th century who were most influenced by him, Diderot, d'Holbach, even Kant in his own way, rarely cited him directly. It was too dangerous. But the books continued to circulate. In clandestine editions, in private libraries, in secret circles of loyal readers. From generation to generation, whenever a country loosened censorship, Spinoza would reappear. And when, in the late 18th century and the 19th century, European thought finally began to free itself from the most rigid religious constraints, Spinoza was rediscovered with a kind of awed reverence. Goethe confessed that the Ethics had been one of the books that changed his life the most. Hegel said that one was either a Spinozist or not a philosopher. Nietzsche, when he discovered Spinoza as an adult, wrote to a friend that he had found a precursor, a distant brother through the centuries. Einstein, in the 20th century, when asked if he believed in God, replied that he believed in the God of Spinoza, the God that reveals itself in the harmonious order of the universe, and not in a God that cares about the individual destinies of human beings. And time placed the silent philosopher of The Hague in the place he deserved. One of the 3 or 4 most influential thinkers in the history of Western philosophy, perhaps, if we are honest, the most courageous of them all. Because there are brilliant philosophers, there are erudite philosophers, there are influential philosophers, but few have managed to unite in the same person intellectual brilliance, geometric clarity, spiritual depth, and the absolute courage to live according to what they thought, even when that way of living cost everything: family, community, health, and ultimately life. Baruch Spinoza succeeded and left behind, for those who have eyes to read, a meticulous map of how the human soul works, how fears are constructed, how invisible chains are forged, and how step by step, proposition by proposition, with geometric patience, those chains can be dismantled. Now that you know the man, we need to get to the heart of the matter. We need to talk directly about hell, about how it was constructed, about who built it, and about why for so long no one had the courage to question the machinery. Start with a simple observation. Hell, as you know it, was not at the origin of monotheistic religions. Read that again. It was not at the origin, it was not there at the beginning. The idea of a place of eternal torment, with unquenchable fire, with torturing demons, with condemned souls screaming forever, was not part of early Christianity in the way it became later. And it was not in any way part of the ancient Judaism that Spinoza knew from the inside, having studied the original texts in Hebrew since childhood. This is something that Spinoza perceived with meridian clarity, and that he, in the subtext of his works, left recorded for those who knew how to read. The Old Testament, when you read it carefully, hardly speaks of an afterlife. The patriarchs die and are gathered to their people. There are vague references to Sheol, a kind of subterranean shadow where the dead rest without distinction between good and evil. There are no detailed descriptions of paradise. There are no detailed descriptions of hell. The religion of the ancient Hebrews was a religion of the present life. God's promises were earthly promises: prosperity, numerous descendants, fertile land, peace in daily life. The punishments were also earthly: drought, disease, exile, military defeat. The figure of hell, as it became popularized, began to take on more defined contours only in the last centuries before the Christian era, under the influence of other cultures. Persian eschatology, with its radical dualism between light and darkness. Greek mythology, with Hades and Tartarus. The apocryphal apocalypses of the intertestamental period, which began to elaborate increasingly dramatic visions of the final judgment. It is in this cultural milieu that Christianity was born, and it is from there that it began to inherit, little by little, images of post-mortem torment. But it was only from the 3rd and 4th centuries that hell began to be systematized as a central doctrine. Church fathers like Tertullian, Augustine, and later medieval thinkers like Thomas Aquinas worked for centuries to construct the complete, technically elaborated image of the place of torment. They described its levels, its populations, its hierarchized demons, the different types of suffering reserved for different types of sin. Dante, in the 14th century, gave the image its most complete and literary form in the Inferno of the Divine Comedy. And from there, painters, preachers, theologians, playwrights, all added layers. When Spinoza was born in the 17th century, that construction had already accumulated over 1,000 years of refinements. It was a cathedral of terror, carefully erected brick by the imagination of generations of men, and, like any cathedral, it served very specific functions. Functions that Spinoza, with his dispassionate geometric gaze, saw with a clarity that few had before him. What is the first function? Social control. Think about it. A population that fears hell is a population that self-controls. You don't need as many guards on the streets. You don't need as many judges in the courts. You don't need as many prisons, because each person carries within themselves their own invisible jailer. Each person watches every thought, every desire, every impulse with the certainty that a record is being made, a dossier is being updated, our sentence is being prepared for the day of final judgment. It is a chilling efficiency. No state, no matter how authoritarian, can match it, because the state can only monitor what you do in public. Hell watches what you think in private. The state can imprison you if you commit a crime. Hell punishes you even for the crime you merely imagined committing. The state can execute you, but death ends the punishment. Hell punishes you for eternity. It is the perfect panopticon, centuries before Bentham. The second function is equally important, legitimization of earthly power. If there is a post-mortem judgment, and if humanity needs intermediaries to know what pleases or displeases God, then these intermediaries become indispensable. Priests, pastors, rabbis, bishops, popes, ayatollahs, each occupying a privileged position in the social architecture, because they control access to salvation. Want your sins forgiven? Seek the priest. Want to know if your soul is at peace with God? Consult the authorized theologian. Want a chance in the other world? Pay the tithe, make the pilgrimage, buy the indulgence, donate to the temple. The third function is perhaps the most sinister, acceptance of present injustice. The idea of hell, combined with the idea of paradise, functions as a formidable social analgesic. The peasant living in abject misery, working from dawn to dusk to enrich a lord who mistreats him, is taught to endure all this with patience. Because they tell him, this suffering is temporary. There is a next world. There the roles will be reversed. The rich man who oppressed you will burn in fire. You who accepted everything with meekness will receive your eternal reward. So do not rebel. Do not question. Do not try to change anything. Endure, pray, obey. How many rebellions have been contained by this promise? How many injustices have been tolerated? How many human beings have lived lives of absurd suffering when they could have risen and fought for something better, simply because they were told that their suffering would be compensated later? Spinoza saw all this, and in his silent room, he wrote the autopsy of the mechanism. There is a specific moment in the Ethics where Spinoza stops, breathes, and makes a statement that, for those who read carefully, is one of the most liberating things a philosopher has ever written. He says, in essence, the following: "The free man thinks of nothing less than death, and his wisdom is a meditation not on death but on life." Stop at this sentence for a moment. The free man, says Spinoza, does not think of death, or rather, thinks as little as possible. He occupies his mind with life, with the understanding of things, with the construction of an existence that makes sense here, now, in this world that he can see, touch, investigate, transform. Now compare this with the type of religiosity dominant in 17th century Europe. Compare it with the mentality that Spinoza saw around him since childhood, an obsessively death-focused mentality, focused on the final judgment, on the salvation of the soul, on the preparations for that final passage that would determine each person's eternal fate. The sermons, the books, the school teachings, the daily prayers, everything revolved around the post-mortem. The present life was treated as an interval, a wait, a test, an anteroom. What really mattered was what came after. Spinoza completely inverted this perspective, and, by inverting it, exposed one of the deepest reasons why the system of hell became so powerful. Because when you teach a people that the present life does not really matter, that it is merely a preparation for what is to come, you achieve two simultaneous things. First, you make people endure the evils of the present with resignation. Second, you make them stop seriously investing in building a good life here. Why bother transforming society? Why fight for earthly justice? Why seek deep knowledge about the material world? All of this is fleeting. What matters is the soul, and the soul is managed by the soul specialists, who happen to be the same people who profit from this management. Spinoza saw this dynamic with a clarity that must have been for him uncomfortable, because it meant recognizing that the religion in which he was raised and the dominant religions around him were part of a system that, no matter how well-intentioned some of its individual practitioners were, functioned objectively to keep humanity in a state of perpetual fear and dependence on its mediators. But he also saw another thing, equally important. He saw that fear is not something that people naturally feel in relation to death and the beyond. Fear needs to be taught. It needs to be cultivated. It needs to be fed generation after generation, with vivid images, with terrifying stories, with solemn rituals that reinforce the seriousness of the threat. Without this constant effort to produce fear, the threat of hell would wither. Without the dramatic paintings on the walls of churches showing the damned being tormented, without the weekly sermons describing in imaginative detail the torments reserved for sinners, without catechetical teaching from the earliest childhood, without all this, the idea would lose strength. And here is one of the deepest points of Spinoza's analysis. He realized that human affections, and fear is one of the most powerful, are not immutable natural givens. They are to a large extent constructed by experience and education. The child born in a specific religious environment is emotionally shaped by the images, stories, and rituals of that tradition. They learn to feel guilt about certain acts. They learn to feel shame about certain thoughts. They learn to fear certain supernatural consequences. And these emotional learnings established in childhood become so deeply rooted that later, the adult confuses these feelings with universal truths, with natural reactions to objective realities. But they are not. They are learned patterns. Patterns that could have been different if the person had been raised in a different culture. A person raised in a Buddhist culture may feel profound peace in the face of the idea of reincarnation. A person raised in a Hindu environment may feel reverence towards gods that to a Westerner would seem strange. A person raised among staunch atheists may feel total serenity in the face of the possibility of personal annihilation in death. Feelings, therefore, are not universal responses to universal realities. They are culturally shaped responses to culturally transmitted conceptions. This idea, which today seems almost obvious after 3 centuries of anthropology, was explosive when Spinoza formulated it, because it relativized all the emotional authority of the dominant religions. If the terror you feel regarding hell is a product of your education, and not a natural response to an independent metaphysical reality, then this terror can be dissolved through proper education. It can be dissolved through knowledge. It can be dissolved through understanding. And that is exactly what Spinoza set out to do. Not only to intellectually demonstrate that the traditional hell does not exist, but to offer an emotional path to liberation. A path through which a person who has understood these things can, little by little, free themselves from the fear that was planted in them without their consent. He called this path the intellectual love of God. The name sounds strange, abstract, almost mystical, but what he meant is something very concrete. When you deeply understand that everything that happens in the universe happens according to necessary laws, and that these laws are the expression of an infinite reality that is in itself God, then something changes within you. You stop fighting against reality. You stop praying for miracles that will not come. You stop feeling guilty for having feelings that are natural responses to the circumstances in which you find yourself. You begin to accept the deep order of things, not with passive resignation, but with a kind of active joy. The joy of participating, even if as a finite and transient mode, in that infinite totality that is the only truly real thing. From this perspective, the fear of hell simply loses its meaning. Not because you decided not to be afraid, but because the mental structure that sustained that fear has dissolved. You have seen through it, and what remains is a peace that the preachers of eternal fire will never be able to offer you, because they themselves live trapped within the system they preach. This is perhaps Spinoza's most precious offer to you, not the liberation from God, on the contrary, the reunion with God, but a God who does not need to be feared, a God who is reality itself, a God whose knowledge does not humiliate you, but elevates you, a God before whom you do not kneel in terror, but bow with the silent reverence of one who has finally understood where they have been all along. We now need to talk about something that Spinoza understood, with a precision that for me remains one of the most impressive aspects of his work. We need to talk about how fear, once planted, feeds on itself, how it takes root so deeply in the structure of personality that the person begins to defend it, without realizing as if it were part of themselves. Think of a curious phenomenon. You may have noticed this. When you try to talk to someone who grew up in a very strict religious belief, and you try with all gentleness to show that certain ideas of that belief may not be literally true, something strange happens. The person does not react with intellectual curiosity. They do not react with investigative interest. They react with anguish, with anxiety, sometimes with open hostility. Why does this happen? Spinoza would have a precise answer. It happens because that belief is not just in the person's head as an opinion among others. It is intertwined with their emotional structure, with childhood memories, with the faces of parents and grandparents who taught these things with love, with the rituals that marked the most important moments of life, with the prayers that comforted them in times of deep pain. To take away the belief is to uproot all of this together. It is to tear away a part of oneself, and the organism, as intelligent as it is, resists any amputation. That is why the system of hell is so difficult to dismantle, even when people can intellectually recognize its weaknesses, because it is not just a theory, it is a deep emotional layer. It is a living fabric that grows along with the person from childhood and becomes inseparable from them. Spinoza knew this, and that is why he did not write as someone who wants to convert adversaries. He wrote as someone who offers a path to those who, for some reason, have already begun to suspect. To those who already feel deep down that there is something strange in the teaching they received. To those who have the courage to look within and recognize that certain parts of what they were taught never truly made sense, but that they accepted out of fear, out of respect, out of love for those who taught. For these people, Spinoza offers an exit, and the exit begins with a brutally honest realization. Most of what we call sincere religious faith is, in fact, faith imposed by fear. It is not a free choice. It is not a conviction after examination. It is a conditioning established before the person had the capacity to choose anything. The child who learns to fear hell at 5 years old did not choose to fear. They were taught to fear. And that teaching is engraved so deeply that, decades later, even if they intellectually reject the idea, the fear remains there, living in a layer below consciousness, appearing in dreams, surfacing in moments of crisis, taking over in situations of vulnerability. One of the most moving things we can observe, in any culture where hell has been taught with intensity, is the phenomenon of elderly people, already declared atheists for decades, asking for a priest or pastor on their deathbed, not because they have returned to belief, but because that deep fear, conditioned in childhood, reactivates in the face of imminent death. It is an almost automatic reflex, an emotional scar so deep that it resists even the most elaborate rational thought. Spinoza would have cried at such scenes, not out of hatred for religion, but out of compassion for people, because he saw and described with geometric clarity how this emotional imprisonment works, how each generation passes on to the next, not only doctrines, but affective states, inoculated fears, cultivated guilt, taught shames, all transmitted as if it were part of human nature, when in fact it is a carefully constructed cultural fabrication. And he offered, to anyone who wanted, a method of deprogramming. The method is called in his vocabulary the adequacy of ideas. You examine each idea you carry in your head, each conviction, each supposed knowledge, and you ask, in front of each one, whether it is adequate or inadequate. An adequate idea is one that you can follow in its logical structure, from which you clearly see the foundation, about which you can make internal demonstrations. An inadequate idea is one that you carry out of inertia, that was deposited in you by others, that you never truly examined, but that influences your feelings and behaviors as if it were demonstrated truth. The philosophical work for Spinoza is this patient and often painful work of distinguishing within yourself the adequate ideas from the inadequate ones, and of gradually replacing the inadequate ones with the adequate ones, through careful examination, sustained reflection, and meditation on the reasons for things. It is a lifelong task. No one finishes this task. No one becomes completely free from the inadequate ideas they absorbed in childhood, But each inadequate idea that you identify and replace is a small shackle that breaks. Each old fear that you understand as a human construction, and not as a natural reaction to a real threat, is a door that opens. Each unjustified guilt that you manage to dissolve through understanding is a part of you that returns to your hands. And hell, my friend, is one of the first ideas to be examined in this process. Because if there is one idea that was planted in your head before you could consent, if there is one idea that emotionally influences almost all areas of your life without you realizing it, if there is one idea that was carefully cultivated in you for purposes that are not necessarily your own, that idea is hell, whether in the traditional Christian form, whether in the Muslim form, or in any other version of the same basic concept. The function is always the same: to produce a person who self-controls out of fear, a person who watches themselves in terror, a person who obeys without being forced. Spinoza, in the silence of his room in The Hague, offered to all who wanted to listen a different alternative, not a life without ethics. On the contrary, a much more demanding ethics, but an ethics that is not based on the fear of punishment, but on the understanding of what truly makes a human being flourish. An ethics that arises from understanding, not from terror. An ethics that produces joy, not anxiety. An ethics where doing good is not fulfilling a rule imposed by an invisible judge, but rather following the deepest nature of what we are, which is the natural tendency of each being to persevere in its being and to expand its capacity to exist. This is perhaps the most beautiful discovery of all his work, that an ethical life is possible without the threat of hell. That virtue does not need fear to sustain itself, that human beings, once they understand their true nature, tend naturally towards what is good, what is just, what is generous, because these things as homem de caráter excepcional, cuja vida era testemunho de suas ideias. Ele não apenas pensou sobre a moralidade, mas viveu-a de maneira exemplar. Spinoza demonstrou que a verdadeira ética não depende do medo de punições sobrenaturais, mas sim de um entendimento profundo da natureza humana e das consequências de nossas ações. Ele acreditava que a moralidade surge da razão e da empatia, não da obediência cega a dogmas ou ameaças de castigo. Essa visão é revolucionária e desafiadora, pois nos convida a reavaliar nossas motivações e a buscar uma vida guiada pela compreensão e pela conexão com os outros. A ausência do inferno, portanto, não significa a ausência de moralidade. Em vez disso, abre espaço para uma ética mais autêntica, baseada na responsabilidade pessoal e na consideração pelas consequências de nossas ações. Quando deixamos de lado a ideia de um juiz cósmico que nos observa, somos forçados a confrontar a realidade de nossas escolhas e a impactar diretamente a vida dos outros. Isso pode ser assustador, mas também é libertador. Nos permite agir de acordo com nossos valores e princípios, em vez de simplesmente seguir regras impostas por medo. Spinoza nos convida a ver a vida como uma oportunidade para cultivar virtudes, como a justiça, a generosidade e a compaixão. Ele nos mostra que a verdadeira felicidade não vem de evitar punições, mas de viver de maneira que respeite a dignidade e o bem-estar dos outros. Essa abordagem exige coragem e um compromisso com a verdade, mesmo quando isso significa desafiar normas sociais ou crenças profundamente enraizadas. A vida de Spinoza é um exemplo claro de como essa filosofia pode ser aplicada. Ele viveu em uma época em que a dissidência religiosa era frequentemente punida com severidade. No entanto, ele se manteve fiel às suas convicções, mesmo quando isso significava se afastar de sua comunidade e enfrentar o ostracismo. Sua coragem em buscar a verdade, independentemente das consequências, é uma inspiração para todos nós. Ele nos lembra que a busca pela compreensão e pela liberdade é um caminho que vale a pena, mesmo que seja solitário. Ao refletirmos sobre a vida de Spinoza e suas ideias, somos desafiados a considerar como podemos aplicar esses princípios em nossas próprias vidas. Como podemos viver de maneira mais autêntica, mais conectada aos outros e mais responsável por nossas ações. Como podemos cultivar uma ética que não dependa do medo, mas sim da razão e da empatia? Essas são perguntas que cada um de nós deve enfrentar, e a resposta pode ser tão única quanto cada indivíduo. Em última análise, a mensagem de Spinoza é uma de esperança e possibilidade. Ele nos mostra que, embora o medo tenha sido uma força poderosa na história da humanidade, também temos a capacidade de transcender essa limitação. Podemos escolher viver de maneira que honre nossa humanidade e a dos outros. Podemos optar por construir um mundo onde a moralidade é baseada na compreensão mútua e no respeito, em vez de na obediência a regras impostas por medo. Essa visão é desafiadora, mas também profundamente libertadora. Ao abraçá-la, podemos começar a criar um futuro onde a liberdade e a responsabilidade andam de mãos dadas, onde a verdadeira moralidade é uma escolha consciente e onde a vida é vivida em sua plenitude sem as correntes do medo. Essa é a verdadeira herança de Spinoza, e é um legado que continua a ressoar em nossos dias. For decades, in later testimonies, as one of the kindest and most upright men they had ever known. How can a man who does not believe in eternal punishment be so honorable? The answer lies at the core of his philosophy, and it is one of the most beautiful discoveries that the Western tradition has produced. The answer is that virtue, when well understood, does not need fear to sustain itself. It sustains itself. Because the virtuous life, the honest life, the generous life, is literally the life that makes a human being flourish. It is the life that leaves you at peace with yourself. It is the life that allows for deep relationships with others. It is the life that sustains clear thinking, peaceful sleep, a heart in order. The opposite life, the life based on deceit, manipulations, and daily small cruelties, carries within itself its own punishment, not in a post-death future, here and now, in the form of constant anxiety, superficial relationships, a fragmented self that is never truly at peace. This is a discovery that modern psychology, centuries after Spinoza, would confirm in multiple ways. People who live in accordance with deep values report higher levels of satisfaction. People who treat others well build support networks that enrich their own lives. Honest people sleep better. Generous people age with more serenity. Not because they are rewarded by an external judge, but because the very structure of the human psyche is such that these ways of existing produce well-being, while the opposing ways produce suffering. Spinoza saw this before any psychology existed. He saw it purely through careful observation of the workings of the human soul and through rigorous deduction from first principles, and he realized one thing that still impresses me today. He realized that ethics based on the fear of hell, paradoxically, produces worse results than ethics based on understanding. Because a person who behaves well only out of fear of punishment is not truly being virtuous. They are being calculating. They are making a probability calculation regarding the afterlife. And at the moment when vigilance loosens, when they think no one is watching, when they discover a loophole in the system, that person slips. Because their goodness did not come from within. It came from an external threat. And every external threat, sooner or later, loses strength. The person who has understood, on the contrary, the deep reason why certain ways of acting are better than others, does not need vigilance. They act the same way alone or accompanied. They act the same way when being observed and when no one sees. Because what sustains them is not fear, it is understanding. And understanding, once established, is much more stable than any fear. There is a wonderful phrase from Spinoza, in the last pages of the Ethics, that captures this definitively. He says, in essence, that blessedness is not the reward of virtue, but virtue itself, and that we do not rejoice because we have restrained our passions, but rather, because we rejoice in this, we can restrain our passions. Read this sentence slowly. It completely inverts traditional logic. Tradition said, restrain your bad impulses to deserve happiness in heaven. Spinoza says, deeply understand your passions, rejoice in that understanding, and from that joy you will naturally restrain what needs to be restrained, not because you are punishing yourself, but because the very joy of understanding is stronger than any immediate impulse. It is a radical inversion. It removes the moralizing effort and replaces it with the pleasure of understanding. It removes punishment and replaces it with lucidity. It removes hell and replaces it with life here now, lived with intensity and awareness. This is Spinoza's true revolution. He did not destroy ethics. On the contrary, he built a much more solid ethics because it is based on the real nature of human beings and not on external threats that, when examined, reveal themselves to be fabricated. He built an ethics that flourishes from within. That does not need invisible executioners. That does not require blind obedience to human intermediaries. That does not degrade the adult to an eternally watched child. An ethics for free human beings, or at least for human beings walking towards freedom. And here is the secret that most people will never realize. The system of hell did not make humanity more moral during the centuries it dominated. It only made humanity more anxious, more internally divided, more submissive to authorized intermediaries. The worst crimes in European history, the Crusades, the Inquisitions, religious wars, the theologically justified colonial massacres, were committed in full force of the doctrine of eternal fire. People who firmly believed in hell burned other people in public squares. People who recited the Our Father every day approved the torture of heretics. People who regularly confessed their sins participated in genocides. How is this possible? It is possible because the system of hell, far from producing truly ethical people, produces only obedient people. And obedience is not ethics. Obedience is the opposite of ethics. Ethics requires independent thought, examination of each action, personal responsibility for the consequences. Obedience requires only following what has been determined by recognized authorities. An obedient person can do terrible things if the authorities so determine. An ethically developed person resists, even alone, even against the authorities, when those authorities command what is unjust. Spinoza produced the philosophy of the second person, of the ethically developed person, of the person who thinks for themselves, of the person who does not need hell to be good, nor heaven to be generous, nor invisible watchers to be honest. It is the philosophy we need, perhaps more than ever. We have reached the end of our journey. Because a philosophy that does not touch life is not philosophy. It is mental decoration, and what Spinoza built with such care, such suffering, such patience, was a philosophy that touches life. That touches yours, if you let it. So let's go. The first thing you need to do after hearing all this is to have the courage to look inside yourself and recognize the fears that dwell there. Not the superficial fears, those we easily talk about, the deep fears. The ones that were planted before you had the capacity to consent. The ones that shape your reactions without you realizing it. The ones that appear in moments of vulnerability, in insomnia, in sudden anguish, in the nights when sleep does not come. Some of these fears have names: fear of death, fear of having lived wrongly, fear of having disappointed someone invisible, fear of a judgment that never ends. Spinoza offered tools to examine these fears, not to deny them, not to pretend they do not exist, but to understand them, to see their origins, to understand why they are there, and from that understanding, to begin, slowly, to dissolve them. It is a lifelong work. It will not happen in one night, it will not happen in 1 week, but it can start today. And it can start with a simple question: what are the things I believe without ever having really examined? What are the convictions I carry out of inertia, because they were deposited in me by my parents, by my school, by my culture, by my historical time? And among these convictions, which ones harm me? Which ones produce anguish in me without offering any real gain? Which ones enslave me instead of liberating me? You do not need to reject everything at once. You do not need to become a militant atheist overnight. You do not need to abandon anyone you love. Spinoza's journey was long. It began with small silent questions within a young mind. It went through years of careful examination. It took a lifetime to unfold in all its consequences. And even so, he died knowing that he had left unfinished things, open questions, investigations to be made. Your journey can follow the same pace, slowly, carefully, honestly, not competitively, because it is not a race. There is no prize for who arrives first. There is no judge keeping score. There is only you before your own conscience, trying to see more clearly what is really going on inside and around you. Because all this story, at its core, was a story about death, about how humanity deals with finitude, about the fictions we invent to try to tame the most brutal and universal fact of existence, about how some of these fictions, instead of comforting us, have tormented us for centuries. Spinoza had a specific stance towards death, and I would like to share it with you, because it seems to me to be one of the most beautiful things in his philosophy. He did not say that death is good. He did not romanticize death. He did not pretend that it does not exist or that it does not matter, but he said that a wise person spends little time thinking about death and much time living, because death, in the sense that it will truly come to each of us, is simply a natural fact, a term in the process, a consequence of being finite beings in an infinite universe. There is neither punishment nor reward in it, just the end of the particular finite way we were for a few decades. The substance of which we were an expression continues. The laws that produced us continue. The infinite reality of which we briefly participated continues, and we as a particular expression dissolve back into what we have always been made of. This view may sound austere, for some, even cold, but if you meditate on it calmly, you discover that it has a kind of deep tenderness, because it invites us to stop wasting energy on an anxiety that serves no purpose. Death will come, for everyone. There is no way to avoid it. So, instead of spending life terrified of it, why not spend life living? Why not dedicate our attention to better understanding, to loving more, to creating beautiful things, to leaving the world a little better than we found it? The fear of death, when you examine it closely, is a great thief of life. It takes presence, it takes serenity, it takes the ability to be whole in the moment you are in. And the traditional hell system, remember, is precisely an intensification of the fear of death. It transforms death, which is merely an end, into a doorway to torments even worse than anything we might experience now. It multiplies terror. Getting out of this system is reclaiming death as a natural fact among others. It is being able to look at it with respect, without exaggerated reverence. It is being able to live each day not as a waiting room for judgment, but as an expression of an existence that has value in itself, here now in this world. The third and final thing I wanted to tell you is about what to do with all this, because knowing is not enough. Understanding intellectually is not enough. What Spinoza proposes at its core is a practice, a continued practice, a practice of examining ideas, cultivating healthy affections, living in coherence with what reason shows as true. This practice has some concrete elements. The first is to study, read, think, talk to people who think. Do not settle for easy answers, slogans, or catchphrases. The journey to mental freedom requires material for the mind, and this material is available in books, in works, in dialogues. Just seek it out. The second is to observe yourself. Observe your own thoughts. Observe your own emotional reactions. Ask, in the face of each intense feeling, where it came from, whether it is an appropriate response to the present or an echo of old conditioning. This observation, practiced with patience, gradually transforms the way you live. The third is to cultivate relationships. Spinoza, despite being seen as a solitary philosopher, deeply valued friendships. He had few, but good ones. He corresponded with people he admired. He cared for his friends. He recognized that no human being becomes free alone. We need each other. We need people who help us think, who offer us different perspectives, who support us in difficult times. The fourth, and perhaps the most important, is to live in coherence. Not perfect. No one achieves perfect coherence, but a tendential coherence, trying to make your actions reflect what you have understood, not lying to yourself, not pretending convictions you do not have, not submitting to rituals you consider empty just for social convenience, not betraying in practice what you have already seen in theory to be true. Spinoza lived this way. Therefore, when he died in that modest room in The Hague at the age of 44, coughing blood and glass dust, he was at peace, because he had lived according to what he thought. He had paid the price. He had crossed the crossing without betraying himself. and he could close his eyes without regrets of that specific kind that tortures so many human beings in the end, that regret of having lived a life that was not theirs, of having pleased many people, and not having pleased themselves, of having followed paths chosen by others. This is perhaps the greatest gift that his story can give you, the demonstration that it is possible to live an entire life, until the end, without betraying oneself, even when the price is high, even when you lose your family, even when the community curses you, even when a fanatic tries to kill you, even when the authorities ban your books, even when you die poor and almost unknown, buried in a grave that would be lost over time. If you are at peace with yourself, all of this is bearable, and if you are not at peace with yourself, nothing compensates. Not fortune, not fame, not recognition, not the heaven promised by preachers. Peace, my friend, is earned in only one way: living with honesty, thinking with courage, loving with generosity, dying without resentment. This is the true eternal life that Spinoza discovered, not a personal continuity after death, but a quality of existence, here and now, that participates in the eternal because it connects with what does not pass, with truth, with understanding, with love for things as they really are. This eternal life is available to you, at this moment, without needing to die to access it, without needing to obey anyone, without needing to pay any intermediary. It only requires your silent courage to start thinking for yourself. We began by talking about a child kneeling by the bed, taught to fear a fire that never goes out. We end by talking about an adult who, after everything, can look at this imaginary fire and smile serenely, because he knows it is not there. If you have come this far, something in you has changed. It may be little, it may be much, it may be just a small crack in an old belief. But cracks, when they are genuine, do not close anymore. They will expand over time until one day the entire structure falls and you discover, behind it, the clear and simple light of freedom. Baruch Spinoza died on February 21, 1677, almost 350 years ago, but his ideas are alive. They are alive in every person who, in any corner of the world, dares to think for themselves. They are alive in every reader who opens his works and feels, for the first time, that someone there had the courage to say what needed to be said. They are alive now, in you. And this is, in the end, the only real immortality that exists. Not the personal continuity of an individual soul in a paradise of clouds, but the passing of a flame from one generation to another, through words, through books, through the silent conversations between minds separated by time, but united by the honest search for truth. A man only becomes truly free the moment he stops fearing a fire that was never lit. Now you know, and what you will do with this knowledge depends entirely on you. Thank you for walking with me this far. It has been an honor. May you live. May you think. May you love. May you die one day, far from this, with the same serenity as Baruch Spinoza in that little room in The Hague. Without fear, without guilt, without hell,